We need to find a way to engage the US government so that they bring more investment to Australia to do downstream processing and make sure that we share the benefits so that there's a national benefit, not just benefits for individual Australian companies.
Which are the rare earths the US really needs and that Australia can realistically supply?
Well, there's 17 different rare earths, but only 4 really matter. They are dysprosium and terbium and neodymium and praseodymium. They're essential for magnets that go into EVs, wind turbines. Australia does have rare earth elements under its subsoil, but so does the United States. So if you were talking about a sort of really straight answer, what does Australia have that the US doesn't have? They'd be things like manganese, cobalt, bauxite. The US doesn't have high-grade manganese. It's 100% reliant on imports. Australia was the 3rd largest producer of manganese back in 2023. So that's the sort of big picture. And then to sort of explain more generally, the US needs everything that Australia has because Australia is a mining country, unlike what the US has been. So Australia has decades of experience mining and the US is kind of just looking back into this now.
You've been included in recent consultations the Australian government has been running on how an Australian critical minerals reserve stockpile could work. Is the government late in pitching the formal details of that stockpile to the US?
No, I wouldn't say it's late. You know, the Australian government proposed this before it was elected, so this is several months ago, and it was trying to signal to the United States that Australia is open for business and Australia has some critical strategic minerals that the US needs. I think it also wants to co-design this stockpile with the United States because the US Department of War has its own stockpile for minerals, but some of its commercial companies like your Ford and your Tesla, they'll be relying on just-in-time supply chains. And so I think the Australian government wanted to remain flexible and talk with the Trump administration to plug holes and see actually what they were most interested in before Australia finalised and rolled out this strategic reserve.
The US administration has begun to do deals directly with Australian companies though. So is it now critical in terms of time to lock in supply, to lock in what Australia can offer?
I think it is, and that's why the meeting next week between the Prime Minister and the President is so critical to clinch a deal, because the US has shown it's interested in working directly either with Australian companies sending their concentrate to the United States or actual miners opening up like Lynas in Texas so that the US can benefit from Australian mining expertise and know-how. We need to find a way to engage the US government so that they bring more investment to Australia to do downstream processing and make sure that we share the benefits so that there's a national benefit, not just benefits for individual Australian companies, because they're a very small section of the Australian economy.
Is there a reason why the US would want to do a deal with the Australian government as opposed to directly with Australian companies when it comes to rare earths?
This is the hard question. It would be a hard sell for Australia's Prime Minister to talk about what our value proposition is. One of the ways that could be achieved is co-development and joint ventures so that we do things at a faster pace. China's had several decades of being able to develop the processing technology in critical minerals. We kind of need to leapfrog that and doing things together, scientists from the US, metallurgists from Australia and geologists. They could do things at a faster pace, and I think some co-investment in infrastructure to do the processing could speed things up.
Do you think the Australian government has the leverage it had hoped it would with critical minerals when it comes to dealing with the United States? Or can the United States do its own deals and also source critical minerals and rare earths elsewhere?
There's 2 camps in the United States, those that think that the US should go it alone and be mining in the US and doing all of its own processing and end-to-end supply chains, and those that want to tap more into global supply chains, going to countries like Australia, Canada, even Brazil, that have these mines that are already operational. So there's this tension underlying within the US administration, and it really depends what kind of deal our Prime Minister can offer. So if he can make something that's really attractive and impactful and has some media cut through for the President, it's more likely that an Australia-US minerals deal could happen.
And if Australia is trying to lock in supplying the US with rare earths at the expense of processing and value adding onshore in Australia, should the Australian government and the Prime Minister be asking what Australia's rare earths will be asked for, whether the purpose is defence or commercial. Should that matter?
I mean, this is the difficult thing, is that you need critical minerals for a variety of different industries, whether it's defence, advanced technologies or clean energy. And there's a bit of a mismatch between the Australian government priorities and the Trump administration in terms of clean energy, for example. So the reasons Australia might want to do more processing of minerals itself is to provide more of an industry in solar panels, for example. In the US, they're much more focused on minerals for defence applications. The economics of it, though, is really difficult because you only need tiny quantities of these minerals for anything that we're talking about. So there's no commercial reason to do them in bulk. And that means that you can't just do them for the defence. They also need to be done for things like EVs, which have the economies of scale to do it. So I think the good news story is that they're needed for everything, things that the Australian government wants, things that the American government wants. And somewhere in between there, they can actually produce these for either purpose.
And so when it comes to the implications for the Australian Prime Minister in his meeting in the Oval Office with Donald Trump next week, what level of risk and what level of opportunity do you think exists as a result of that meeting?
Yeah, I think we saw with Ukrainian President Zelensky that there is a high degree of risk in meeting with the president in the Oval Office if you don't have a very positive message and a plan going into that meeting, because there's the potential that you could be ambushed or other issues could be brought up, potentially even AUKUS, because the president has shown that he likes to put big policy items on the table in front of the media. I think that there'll be exceptional planning going into this meeting to make sure that it's successful. That will really require a big offering from the Australian government as a sort of centrepiece of the engagement to really capture President Trump's imagination. And hopefully that will produce a good outcome for both countries.
How closely will China be watching, and how difficult will it be for the Prime Minister to walk the diplomatic line between the US and its biggest trading partner on this topic, rare earths?
So difficult. Australia exports a majority of its minerals to China for processing. 90% of Australia's lithium goes to China for processing. That has been some of the concern that the US has had, that Australian minerals always go through China. That's why the US has been doing some deals directly with Australian companies for minerals to go from the Australian company through Australian ports to the United States for processing, for instance. And so the US is concerned about Australia's trade relationship with China, but Australia also knows it needs China. And so if Australia can work with other countries on the processing technology, the midstream of this supply chain, that's the main way to unlock this supply chain.
Hayley Channer, thank you.
My pleasure.